Hey, sovereign wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to Iran War Week 6, the final acts, Lebanon, the deal, and the big print. We're going to be covering two parts in this week's episode. First, in part one, we're going to be going through Iran War Week 6, the final acts. Now, while many people think it's going to escalate, we covered everything step by step over the last 6 weeks and how it was leading to the deal rather than an actual World War III or nuclear war like everyone was predicting. So I'm going to be covering how I think, based upon the information that we have, how the Iran war ends, the role of Lebanon, the deals that are being negotiated, and what they actually mean, because this is one of the biggest changes we will ever experience in our lifetime. And that's not me being hyperbolic or exaggerating. This is literally the construct of the end of the post-World War II Bretton Woods system. And of course, you need to protect yourself and be sovereign, because in line with the crisis is a global reset that you need to navigate and get your way through. So with that in mind, in part two, I'm going to be discussing what the big print means and the big print, when it actually begins. To do that, I actually sat down on BTC sessions with the author of the big print, Lawrence Lepard, and we had a conversation on the war, markets, the reset, how it relates to the military industrial complex, and everything in between. So we're going to be discussing exactly how you get to a $7 to $10 trillion big print and what the consequences are and how to protect yourself. So without further ado, let's jump right into part one, the final acts, how the Iran war ends, the Lebanon situation, the deals that are being negotiated, what they mean, and the global reset. So as a quick recap, I'll make sure that all of these week 1 to 6 updates and everything that comes next until we're done is on one blog for those that want to learn exactly how these things work with real-time analysis in real time, so you can see what I was able to predict, what I wasn't, and how you can actually use that analysis in order to make sure that you protect yourself as well. So during week 1, when it was live and happening, I talked about that this was the initial shock phase, the shock and awe campaign. In week 2, this led the framework for the global reset with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which led to the negotiation of approximately 50 different commodities and essential energy assets and resources, from food to fertilizer and everything in between, which had to be repriced around a framework and the price of oil, the yields on the bond of the US debt, and how that set the tone for everything that happened afterwards. Week 3, I predicted, when everyone was saying we're going to World War III, that we've now entered into the settlement phase. Everyone from both sides was telling me there's no settlement. This is a long war that's going to go on forever. And I was saying, here's how I think the settlement framework works, from way before the war as well. And this war, in my framework, was in fact negotiated, and there was a strategy to purge the different factions of power rather than a country versus country, US, Iran versus America. There were factions of power affiliated with both the financial industrial complex and the military industrial complex, and a future vision for regional stability and to what you need to do to get rid of the different factions of power to usher in this new world order effectively. In week 4, I discussed the Build Back Better model and how the strategic targeting was about laying the framework for the different trade routes, the different rebuild, and how that works in terms of the companies that benefit from it, and how you're actually able to forward read these things by looking at what is being destroyed. I remember right at the beginning, I said the Middle East will not go into peace, like years ago, until you have normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which I believe we already had via China, and they will be best buddies again at the end of this when the GCC and Iran normalize towards the end. A solution for the Palestinian state. We talked about the border peace, and how it's not justice, but it is the solution that's most likely to happen, and we'll continue to analyze as we get more information. I was also sharing how they can be, Palestine can build its more sovereign status as well, to learn from anybody that's been through this disgusting build back better phase. That's not my words. That's just the words that the World Economic Forum would use for such a thing. And obviously, the third thing is the exit of the US. And one way of exiting is to militarily destroy the US presence in the region and then replace it with new contracts that have both regional negotiations, like defense contracts between Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and then the other factions that were lining up, like UAE, India, and Ukraine, and various other things that happened throughout the deal. Plus, obviously, BRICS towards the east, and then genuine defense contracts with Western financial portfolio companies rather than the US as a nation state, which is more aligned with the military industrial complex. So anyway, we talked about the transition phase and how that it looks and that it had already begun. And then we got the confirmation in week 5. This is where the market confirmed what we were talking about. And we were looking at oil, bonds, and the supply chains that are breaking in order to find the companies that were benefiting, the nations that were benefiting, how to interpret that, and why every time oil hit $115, the yield on the 10-year bond, 4.5%, and the yield on the 30-year bond, approximately 5% on the 30-year yield and 4.5% on the 10-year yield, because that impacts mortgages. It impacts whether there's a recession or a depression. It impacts the price of these force majeure cancellation contracts. And everything in between. And then the countries that will be impacted, and therefore the vulture capitalists, the venture capitalists, and the different national interests like the Belt and Road Initiative, and who's likely to, what the world's likely to look after that as well. So we got the market confirmations that we're headed in this direction. And I talked about, gold prices, markets, and how they're reacting. And finally, what we're going to be covering today in week 6 is the final negotiation mechanics and basically the closing sequence that I'm expecting from here. So now that we've got an understanding of that, we're going to dive right in. One of the most interesting things, now remember, I always put on 2 hats. I speak very differently when I'm wearing my humanitarian hat. That's where I talk about the sheer disgusting ethnic cleansing, genocide, settler colonialism, crimes against humanity, pillaging, and everything that's happening because the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex have zero consideration of human casualty and any type of humanity. They're analyzing spreadsheets, they distance themselves, and they're part of a leveraged Epstein class that just doesn't care and is in these compromised networks that I've always talked about within the proof of weapons network. Now, then we go to the analytical. This is where I take off my humanitarian hat and I be whatever I like it or not. I analyze what I think is happening and I try and take away any bias and any concept of humanity that makes us humans in order to analyze and think like the psychopaths that actually are in charge of where these things go next. And really, I've always said it is theatrical. Now, theatrical does not mean that the deaths are fake or anything like that. Everything is real. The tragedy is real, but they don't care. And so that's not factored into the equation in terms of how these things work. Theatrical means that there is factions of power that have negotiated a predetermined outcome and decided and continually adjust the set of sequences as we go through this managed transition where everybody has agreed on the outcome, but there are also factions of power that try to do false flags and take you off tilt from that plan, and therefore the plan needs to be adjusted. But the outcome has already been predetermined, And at some point, these can go off rail, because what the financial industrial complex does whenever they do their covert missions is they hedge both sides. So they have a plan for the optimum outcome, a plan for how they make money if it goes wrong, and also the hedges that they have in between, so that either way they're able to use the derivatives market in order to manipulate the outcome by controlling the markets as well. And so, with that in mind, what I'd like you to do in this theatrical theme, we have seen that effectively this war has played out on Trump's Truth Social. Calling it truth, I think, is very reflective of how America as an economy works. It's fake it till you make it, lie it into existence, and just PR it to reality rather than anything that is real. In Truth Social, across Twitter and social media. And we started to see these artificial intelligence movies from the Iran side that kind of balanced out the propaganda, because half of this has been an information war. So we've had this two-way propaganda throughout. But the artificial intelligence movie that were coming from the Iran side were really very reflective of a lot of my analysis in terms of the blackmail networks, the financial market manipulation, and the framework by which I use in order to analyze the outcome. And really, a lot of these videos and the AI Lego movies and various other things that have gone viral and become infamous have been telling the story. Of course, it's propaganda from the Iranian side, but it has been really telling the story. So throughout this analysis, as we cover week 6, before we go to the part 2 interview, I'm going to play a few of those videos just to catch you up and lighten the tone slightly as well, despite the humanitarian crisis and severity of the situation. So with that in mind, I'm going to play the first AI video on the Iranian propaganda side, which really goes through the story so far, and how we've had this different game of financial weapons of mass destruction as a result of the attack from America and Israel that have been doing decapitation campaigns. And we set up a game where effectively Iran is being used in order to destroy the US military bases from the Gulf countries and the region. Israel is being used as a decapitation campaign for hardliners. And Iran, in terms of the pragmatic side internally, I believe is doing internal regime change for regime survival. And I hate to use the word regime because that's propaganda in itself, but we do know that the IRGC is effectively an economy within a country. They control the banking, the port, the military side, and they have a structure where there is a supreme leader, a decentralized IRGC, and then a government underneath it. So the government reformist pragmatic side, I believe, is aligned with China, who fund the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund, who's aligned with BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and the financial industrial complex, who can profit from both war and stability. But in the Middle East, they're pushing for a regional stability vision, which involves China's plan for normalization, the removal of the radical Zionist ideology from Israel, the defeat of the neocon radical evangelical Christian Zionists, Lindsey Graham, that type of stuff, narrative within the US, and also the hardliner IRGC, death to Israel, death to America narrative that created that strategic tension that allowed the forever war to exist by having 40 years of Israel saying they're trying to attack us, and Iran saying, we're being told that they're 2 weeks away from a nuke. And so $10 trillion of money printing destabilized the region and really was the backbone of the post-World War II Bretton Woods world order. And we're going to be discussing today exactly how these events end that, and then what you can do to prepare and what it looks like next. So with that in mind, let's play the first AI movie video that kind of recaps the story so far. Enjoy it, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so let's jump right into week 6. To me, week 6 really represents what I believe will be the final acts. Now, we may go on for several weeks and we'll keep going until this thing is over. But to me, this is the final acts of the Iran war. I said that we needed a Hollywood movie in order to end this. And we got the Hollywood movie, which was a failed ground invasion that was meant to go into Iran from most of the analysis and do a ground invasion to steal some highly enriched uranium and then have a Hollywood movie so that that the US can exit and say, hey, we took down the enriched, we took down the nuclear program. Now, the problem is that failed because they fired down some of the fighter jets, and then there was a real freak out where we had this 48-hour deadline where it looked like Trump was threatening the religion of Islam, as well as saying that we're going to have mass civilian casualties, and it was wording around having basically dropping a nuke. And so that led to this 48-hour deadline where in the final hour, Trump capitulated and gave in to the 10-point plan. We'll go around that as well. So that was, I believe, a failed Hollywood movie that was intercepted by the factions of the IRGC that are aligned with the preservation of the forever war military industrial complex model. And so therefore, we ended up derailing the plan slightly, but nothing stops this train. And that was confirmed by the acceptance of the offer with strategic ambiguity so that it could enter into a negotiation phase and a really set up the final front, which I'm going to be covering today as well. And so you notice that Pete Hegseth and Trump and everyone talked about almost like a Venezuelan style mission where they came in and they protected the pilot, cared that they care about lives. And really that was a failed ground invasion mission, which we're going to find out more and more. Many people were analyzing it at the time. Either way, I believe that was meant to be the Hollywood movie that they didn't get. So they replaced it with a different Hollywood movie, which is a rescue mission, despite the fact that the fighter jets were taken down. So, but the most important thing here is I don't think the conflict is collapsing. It's entering into the closing stage of the negotiated end state. Which is obviously the opening up of the Strait of Hormuz, the removal of the post-World War II Bretton Woods New Order, the transfer of assets over to the financial industrial complex, the ending of the forever war model in the Middle East, and the setting up of the next wars so that the military can make up for lost profits as a result of this negotiated outcome. So what do we need in order to get to this next phase? Well, they needed to escalate and set up a new war front, which was Lebanon. And so Lebanon became the next escalation point. And it was also setting up really the final negotiating lever. Now, again, humanitarian hat, analytical hat. Everything I just said is analytical. Let's do humanitarian hat for a second. This is sheer crimes against humanity. I know people that have died as a result of this. I was in a restaurant recently speaking to some of my brothers from Lebanon. And they were telling me about how they've had to rebuild their house 6 times. They live in a civilian area. They pretend that it's Hezbollah under the building. And the amount of deaths and civilian targets that happened, it was pure terrorism of the highest level. Analytical hat. At the same time, they're able to take out some Hezbollah targets. Hezbollah is able to effectively engage in a campaign of strategically weakening Israel and strategically weakening Hezbollah, which is an army connected to funding and building by Iran within Lebanon that was created as a resistance in 1982 from an Israeli invasion after the CIA did multiple infiltration attempts within Lebanon. And obviously, they destroyed the financial system through the IMF, destroyed the currency, destroyed people's savings in the banking system. And it led to the setting up of an alternative financial system where the Lebanese could deposit their gold and jewelry and get an interest-free interest-free loan using their collateral, and the IDF started coming in and destroying the locations where that collateral is and effectively stealing the assets. But what happened here? Why did we get to this negotiation lever? Well, when we did the lead up to the Hollywood movie, the 48-hour deadline, the nuclear threat, and then in the final hour, the complete capitulation, is because the negotiating market levers that I've always been talking about triggered in. We had approximately $115 oil. What did I tell you? Every time you get $115 or above, and we started to get WTI. I covered this all last week in the market levers. You get a capitulation, and Trump has to push a new rabbit out of the hat because the financial industrial complex doesn't want the demand destruction, but it does want the higher prices while it force majeures and renegotiates all of its contracts into this global reset. But they don't want it to go too high because it shuts down economic activity and takes us on another escalation cycle that I believe they're managing the cap of the price. So as soon as oil hit $115 as a result of this, boom, capitulation. The 10-year yield hit approximately 4.5%. If it goes higher, that takes mortgages above 7%, breaks the financial banking infrastructure. If we get the 30-year going above 5%, it creates bondholders and a doom loop in the US debt spiral that means they can't do a managed transition because you enter into a crisis mode, which I don't believe the financial industrial complex wants, but they're prepared for anyway, which we'll be covering in part 2 on the big print as well. But the US original objectives, let's think back to it. What were the original objectives that we were told? Well, firstly, they did Operation Ajax 2.0 and pretended they were protecting the Iranian people while Mossad was effectively creating an environment that would lead to an uprising after Scott Bessent destroyed the currency, destroyed the savings of the Iranian people. That led to an inflationary cycle. And because of all the previous sanctions, there's economic hardship. And so that led to a PR campaign to pretend that the CIA asset, the son of the Shah, was going to come along and save the Iranian people, even though he's just a paid asset that was never going to do that. And that incites people to uprise against their government when the IRGC, a militarized faction, the Guard, when people and Mossad agents combined with them start firing at people, they're going to fire back. Now, there was the propaganda of the 45,000 deaths. When it was confirmed on the Iran side, 3,000, whatever it is, we will never know the full truth. But as a result of that, we got some of the internal regime change, the justification for war, the decapitation campaigns, and then America did the invasion pretending they were saving the Iranian people. But what were the actual goals set when they started saying more of the truth? Well, they started saying that there were 5 strategic objectives. And then as a result of the Strait of Hormuz closure, they added a 6th strategic objective. What was strategic objective 1? Prevent Iran nuclear weapons. That has not been achieved. In the 12-day war, they created the theatrics. So nuclear weapons, not been, there will still be a nuclear program. The number 2, now obviously they've depleted infrastructure above ground, but most of the infrastructure is below ground, which they can't get. The second one is to destroy the missiles and their capacity to effectively, have the drones. Now, there's this asymmetric war where drones powered by artificial intelligence and Russian, Chinese technology, as well as Iranian technology and missiles, mean that you don't need to be, troops on the ground tanks, planes, various other things, because you can fire those planes with missiles, exactly as happened here as well. So the idea is to destroy that. Now, I think they've depleted a lot of the infrastructure, still manufacturing various other things, but obviously they still got imports and relationships with Iran and China. They still got their own capacity, and a lot of it happens underground as well. So that can never be achieved without a over 1 million person ground invasion and maybe 20 years, and still that's absolutely questionable. So we know that that's not possible. Number three was to neutralize any of the military forces. Well, we've been talked about there's maybe 10,000 troops on the Iranian side, plus the ability to call in the people that are now protecting their country. There's like 1 million. So you'd need like 4 million or something crazy in order to actually make that a viable strategy. So that's not there. The fourth is to reduce the proxy networks. To a certain degree, we have seen that containment. This contains, Yemen, who effectively the Biden administration tried to wipe out, failed. Trump administration tried to wipe out, failed. But it ended in a negotiated ceasefire in Gaza and also a deal between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia that right up until now has held. Now, they could close the Red Sea, which would create an economic tsunami after the Strait of Hormuz has been closed. And that would really take down markets and push oil almost up to $200 if that were to happen. But that hasn't happened so far. Then you've got the Iraq side. We've seen different missions there. Then you've got Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has been the final front. And then you've got Hamas within Gaza, which is held up by the border peace and ceasefire arrangement as a result of that. And we move back to that front. But obviously, Israel has continually violated the ceasefire in both Lebanon with Hezbollah and in Gaza with Hamas as well. And we had one little reaction from the Houthis, as a result of breaking the ceasefire with Lebanon as well. But so far, the Houthi side has been contained with a very credible threat. So that's not been achieved, but I think it will be achieved politically, while militarily we get this escalation. Eventually, I've always predicted that the proxies, the resistance, whichever side of the propaganda you want to sit, effectively will be normalized and integrated into the local state armies as part of the regional stability mission. There are some people that would not be on board with that. So they've had decapitation campaigns and things like the pager attack on Hezbollah, which was installed 10 years ago. I think it was allowed to happen from the pragmatic sides of the internal sides of Iran that are effectively managing this transition and agreeing to the optics that we're seeing that I've been covering throughout this whole thing. And then finally, 5 was regime change. Well, we replaced Khamenei with Khamenei, and my personal belief is that Khamenei was on this path. He was very elderly, this was pragmatic for the country and the people. And so therefore there was a transition. I couldn't prove any of that, and it doesn't matter anyway. But I think that the new Khamenei is continuing the work of managing the next phase of the transition. But we've had decapitation campaigns throughout this whole thing. And so I believe that those that are resisting against the plan are being taken out either internally in this very dangerous mission or outsourced to Israel and US as well, effectively. So Iran is destroying the US military bases. Israel is taking out some of the proxy infrastructure. US is taking out some of the economic impact of the bases, which will vassalize Europe more into China's front and BRICS. And then Iran is weakening, and the Hezbollah is weakening Israel, which vassalizes them into economic reconstruction contracts that will be done via the GCC and BRICS. And then you achieve the strategic goals. And the US is weaker. Israel is weaker, Iran is weaker, but there is an economic plan that the financial industrial complex will be funding alongside BRICS, the Gulf countries, and transnational capital. And then they added the sixth goal, which was open the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz has been debated. Now, this is really significant, and I'll be covering more about it in relation to the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. But this effectively gave the following results. You had the MIC pivot from the forever war escalate to de-escalate into the FIC negotiations, the financial industrial complex negotiations that we're seeing right now. And what is the negotiation framework? Well, we had the US 15-point plan that was countered with Iran's 10-point plan that didn't meet any of the 6 strategic goals unless the plan was implemented, and effectively was very Iran favored. And so a clause was taken out in order to reset the final negotiation levers that I'm going to be covering right now. So in its simplicity, what was the settlement framework? Well, the first one was the 15-point plan by the US, which include sanction removal, which the financial industrial complex would like, Iran would like, BRICS would like. Now you need to do it managed because the GCC has been strategically weakened economically. And there was also a civil nuclear program support, i.e. nuclear energy, that is needed to power. Iran is one of the largest sovereign Bitcoin miners in the world. I believe it's done with nuclear energy, as well as the different types of artificial intelligence and everything, and civilian nuclear programs. It consisted of a nuclear freeze in terms of a framework. So you get to enrich, but there's some kind of freeze framework that can be used and is agreed and inspected, like we saw during the previous agreement, JCPOA, that Trump tore up. Enrichment was allowed under basically a set under limits. So that was the same as before Trump tore up the deal. There was a missile program deployed, and basically restructured around certain a framework. So that doesn't achieve the strategic goal. No weapons grade material was part of the condition. The organization that inspects nuclear weapons, the IAEA, supervision as there was before, and some kind of enforcement framework with the IAEA. The gradual compliance based upon implementation of the plan. So just like when you do an M&A deal, you have like payout clauses based upon meeting strategic milestones and goals, which is what we had before, which was there's billions of dollars of sanctioned money in Iran that would be slowly released. And then a broader regional agreement around certain points. And one of those being the Strait of Hormuz and different other economic agreements, which is what Trump is negotiating for the financial industrial complex. Now, that was a lot of tick for tack and going back and forth, but eventually Iran said, here's our 10-point plan, despite the fact that we were told there's no negotiations. And what was in that? There's non-aggression guarantees. So they want guarantees that Iran will not be going to war again via either Israel or US. This was in agreement with the US. Control of the Strait of Hormuz, significant. We'll cover more of that and why that's so significant, because it effectively ends the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. Enforcement rights maintained. So probably some kind of security guarantees with China, Russia, something neutral, Oman, whatever that may be. Full sanctions removal and compensation for all the war damages. This sets up the framework for the removal of sanctions, and we beta tested that because Trump removed sanctions from certain oil tankers in order to reduce the price of oil. We creep up towards that, which everyone said was impossible. I said would happen as for years now. And then reparations around war damages. This is code word for You call it reparations, but why don't we do an economic deal that tie us together financially so that there is no reason to enter into military conflict again and go back to the US forever war model via proxy Israel? And then US military withdrawals, which is effectively probably going to be replaced with renegotiation of all the destroyed infrastructure. Ceasefire across all fronts, which was controversial because was Lebanon mentioned? Was Lebanon not mentioned? Well, we didn't get two-way confirmation of a signed agreement, which is what would have happened if this is a real M&A transaction. And if it wasn't theatrical on both sides, we just reveal the contracts, which would have been signed because there'll be lawyers on both sides. So the fact they're not releasing it implies that two parties are contributing to this game, as it were, as well. But effectively, the end of the Bretton Woods, because this would be priced in Chinese yuan, paid for in Bitcoin in some cases, and the port would be controlled, which was previously international waters protected by the US Navy. So effectively, let's just remind ourselves of the bit of history that we've always covered on Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. After World War II, you had the USD gold standard. What that was effectively was that we had the British pound as the world reserve currency prior to World War I. We then had World War I, the Great Depression, 1929 stock market crash, confiscation of gold into America, World War II, the funding of the Soviet Union in World War I via the Bolshevik Revolution that was funded by Wall Street, as well as the funding of the Nazi National Socialist regime that was funded by Wall Street as well as the creation of the Federal Reserve, which was owned by Wall Street. And so you had capitalism, communism, fascism, all the wars, the Cold War, all the stuff. Anyway, we enter into World War II. Most of that gold was transferred to the US military industrial complex base that was built by not being involved in the war. And then you had the reconstruction of Europe into two fronts that set the framework for the Cold War. This turned the European countries that were economically destroyed into US vassals. And then on the Russian side, and then you had strategic tension to justify more and more war. Now, out of that, you had the British ships that were built during the British Empire, the Dutch ships that were built during the Dutch Empire, and as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the pound stopped being the world reserve currency, and rather than having a gold standard, what happened is that basically, because 75% of all gold that was understood was in Fort Knox and in the US, they said everybody trade their currency to dollars. And you can do that at the IMF. So they created the IMF for that. And then your dollars can be converted into gold. And so that set the new framework of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. So, you know, we had the resistance. So we had that order anyway. And we had the IMF and everything that was created and that framework. But the other thing that was negotiated was effectively, in exchange for this, America set the terms. They had United Nations where they could get away with future wars and crimes against humanity and wrap it up in some kind of framework where there was a Security Council with the superpowers at the time, which propped up the dollar and helped maintain this framework. And then they also had agreements to protect all international waters to allow trade to happen. That was protected by the British naval fleets, the Dutch naval fleets, and the American naval fleets. America built the largest naval fleet and protected those international waters, which meant that all trade could be used in their favor. They set up the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF would get everyone into dollar debt. The World Bank would issue loans. The military would do covert operations to destroy countries. Then you would have the post-Reconstruction neoliberal. You financialize and securitize every economy. And then you would force countries through regime changes to print their own currency, destroy it, and then lend it back to the US government via US treasuries. Those US treasuries would provide the budget for future wars that would then take those wars and make sure that the money goes back into the US stock market, which created this massive pump and dump Ponzi scheme because the dollar is debt. The Fed the Fed socializes losses and privatizes gains. The banks get to print the money, but there's never enough money to pay off the debt because it's all based upon debt. So it's a Ponzi scheme. And every time it goes wrong, the Fed will socialize losses, privatize gains. That creates wealth transfer. You turn all the people into individual debt products through mortgages, credit cards, student loans. You create a Wall Street mechanism for allowing people to allowing businesses to collateralize their stock through the debt markets. And you bankrupt the US government for as long as you can, with now almost $40 trillion of debt. And then you reset the order again, set the new world order when you're at the end of a debt cycle. So that was set up, and that brings us to kind of where we are now. They agreed to protect the international waters. So the Bretton Woods system was propped up by the dollar standard, the debt standard, the export of debt globally, and the ability to implement the military-industrial complex and enforce the waters. Now, this was tested when the Egypt that went through effectively Israel launched a fake false flag war that led to effectively the Egypt taking control of the Suez Canal. And this expelled the British Empire and set the standards. Now, international waters are basically protected by this Bretton Woods system, where you can safe passage for free trade. But the Suez Canal effectively privatized it, led to the expulsion of the British Empire, very similar to what we're seeing with the Strait of Hormuz today. A bit more history. When JFK tried to take on the military-industrial complex, we know what happened to him in 1963. That led to the stealing of the NUMEC nuclear enrichment over to Israel, set up these different blackmail operations with the CIA, Mossad, MI6. And what happened in order to bankrupt the US government at that time as they were setting up? Well, we were in a Vietnamese war, which effectively led to the default of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order gold standard. Because now in this 1971 Nixon shock, you could no longer convert your dollars into gold, and the gold standard effectively entered into a default. So now we entered into a debt standard. So what did you need to do? Well, in 1973, the CIA, I believe the CIA, and many people do believe, assassinated King Faisal of Saudi Arabia and created the petrodollar. This was done at the same time as a Yom Kippur War, and the Yom Kippur War was Israel. And as a result of the atrocities in Palestine and various other things, we had this escalation, and King Faisal did an oil embargo, which created an oil shock and stagflation that followed. This was a significantly less oil shock than the one we're getting from the Strait of Hormuz. But anyway, we had that oil shock that led to the assassination of King Faisal and the agreement of the petrodollar. Now, at this time, George Bush set up Safari Club, which was a covert operation with the regime change Saudi Arabia, with Saudi intelligence, US intelligence, Israeli intelligence. Well, no, they were out of it, but then different intelligence network that effectively led to the environment of 9/11 that was done via those intelligence network that justified all the wars that followed: Iraq, Sudan, Libya, eventually Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and all the different wars that followed. And that was effectively to prop up this petrodollar system, continue the forever war, ensure that the money was coming back to purchase US bonds. That kind of brings us to where we are right now. And that was my long-term thesis. What happened? America became an energy exporter. So now they're competing. So therefore, the petrodollar switched from Saudi buying US bonds to Saudi buying US equities. That changed the influence and dynamics of the network, because where was Saudi's money coming from? Oil sales to China, their number one customer, obviously more people as well. So China started funding the sovereign wealth funds. The sovereign wealth funds would purchase equities, and we had this new transnational capital based upon the manufacturing base of China. We had China join the World Trade Agreement. This is when the manufacturing base of US destroyed the military industrial complex, where it became dependent upon China for its components. And China became the manufacturing base, bringing us to where we are right now. China then set up the Belt and Road Initiative, started building infrastructure and new ports and new trade routes across the world, across Africa, across the Middle East, across Asia. And basically, the enforcement mechanism of the US military industrial complex became dependent upon China. And so this is the moment I think Trump was installed in order to reset the world order via tariffs, destroy all the institutions that propped up the dollar, and then escalate a war that leads to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and breaks it. And that is where we are today. So I think it was in week 2, we covered the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the global reset. So what have we seen this week? Effectively, the strait is closed to anybody other than somebody that negotiates with Iran. And Iran has said, if you want to negotiate a deal, they accept Bitcoin. They also accepted Tether stablecoin at the time, but that was frozen. That was frozen because Genius Act implemented regulations that stated you have to comply with OFAC in these stable coins. And so Tether had to freeze it. And so they stopped using Tether as a stable coin because of the freeze function and started accepting Bitcoin too. Now, please, this is not legal advice around how to circumvent sanctions. Right now, sanctions have been removed for certain activities. And so therefore, a legal Bitcoin transaction can purchase unsanctioned oil from Iran if you negotiate a deal. Not legal advice. This is not about any type of mechanism. You have to follow the law within your country. However, that's what is effectively happened right now. And what is the transaction denominated in? Chinese yuan. So you can pay with Chinese yuan. Effectively, this is chipping away. You can also pay in your local currency. It could be denominated in dollars, but you can't settle in dollars, is the terms. And so this is basically this is the model, as it were, for a post World War II Bretton Woods order. Now, what does this mean? If this can be enforced, it changes international law that was enforced by the Bretton Woods system, because now you can take international waters, and the countries that are in proximity to those international waters can charge a toll and take control. Obviously, that has implication for the Gulf countries and everyone around it. And they don't want Iran to be a superpower. But who is the second largest trade partner of Iran after China? UAE. So if UAE is effectively the largest trade partner of Iran, and allegedly they're in a battle for survival right now because allegedly UAE is an Israeli shill, the narratives we're fed don't quite make sense. Because why haven't they launched a trade war? Because I believe this is a faction of power with the financial industrial complex within Iran that is aligned with China's plan, which normalizes with the Gulf Cooperation Council in order to expel the US, weaken the Zionist military industrial complex project. The media campaign with Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, various other factions of power is weakening radical Zionist neocons within the US. And what did Trump do? He lashed out at them on True Social this week. And then you have obviously the highest level of IRGC, which are revealing themselves by the retaliation campaigns and going through decapitation until eventually we get everyone agreeing on a deal. Now, if for the first time, because the only way that Egypt was able to get to charge a toll was by building a canal and charging for the canal rather than the international waters. But if now we get this done for international waters, that has implications all around the world for previous colonized islands like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, all the victims of a post-colonial world and Singapore built its way out. But if this model works in the Strait of Hormuz, why do you think we've had all these battles and settlements within Yemen that controls the Red Sea, as well as Somaliland separatists with Somalia, that UAE has those strategic ports, as well as the Strait of Hormuz? The area is being divided up in a post-World War II Bretton Woods order. And the FIC want in. So they vassalized deals with UAE, weaken UAE so that you've got leverage to get your part of the port for BlackRock's portfolio companies. You got the same with Saudi Arabia by doing a deal between Yemen, Houthis, and Saudi. And then you got the same in the Strait of Hormuz with Iran, and you have a war to manage that transition and destroy the assets of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. So with that in mind, we're going to go a little bit deeper. Who benefits from it? Exactly, because the media is not telling you the right story, and none of the social media that I've seen is getting this right according to my analysis, because once we understand this, we know how to protect ourselves. So now that we're on the negotiation phase, I'm going to play one of the AI movies that goes through the Iranian propaganda side of what these negotiations are kind of pinned upon. And we've been covering lots of the Epstein files and various other things over way before the Epstein files was released, and how they prop up these leverage networks. So let's take a little bit of break, go to the AI movie, and we'll come back with the final parts.
Help! We need backup!
You can do it, baby!
Okay, that's enough!
You've got 10 seconds! Believe me, you don't want this! 5 seconds! Very serious situation! 3, I'm ready!
One last chance! You know what? Forget it. Let's do this the smart way. We talk. Okay. Let's make a deal. That's a good point. I'll take it. Best negotiation I had today.
Okay, so what's the current position that we're in during week 6? Effectively, China has brokered the framework that effectively has made what is being negotiated in Pakistan. And America accepted Iran's terms. And so, but it was done with ambiguous language so that it could enter into a 2-week negotiation. Now, Trump calls it effectively a workable basis publicly on Truth Social, and saying, and it pointed towards the 10-point plan. Then we get this little shenanigans back and forth saying we put the original 10-point plan in the bin and Iran sent us a new plan and we didn't agree to that plan. So we end up back in what was effectively a ceasefire and then an additional escalation cycle. But I personally obviously have said all along that the outcome is already shaped, but now we have to go through the staging process and the final act. So I believe, what do you do when you're negotiating the final points, when it's very intense? Well, the negotiations are around who's going to control the Strait of Hormuz. That's the real thing. Because they're not just going to hand it over to Iran on their own. there was already concessions that it would go to. Some of it would be Oman, if it can happen at all. There's questions around international law here as well. But immediately, the Gulf countries aren't going to be happy with that. And there is leverage there, although some people are framing Iran's got all the leverage, US has got all the leverage. That's not true. There's a lot of other parties in this agreement. Does China want Iran to have all the power? No, it wants to spread the power across a lot of its countries that it's buying this oil from, including Saudi Arabia, including all the other UAE and various other interests in Qatar. And so you probably, in the end, there will be some kind of private interest by one of the BlackRock portfolio companies, or maybe DP World in Dubai, and maybe even some Chinese interests via a covert investment infrastructure into one of these Dubai companies or Saudi Aramco, or any of these companies. But on the front end, there's probably going to be an agreement that ties all the interested parties together via this new war order. Now, effectively, that is China and American private interest at the very top level. Underneath that, you got transnational capital, military industrial complex. And under that, you got all the proxy battles. And under that, this goes all the way down. But this is a resetting of the world order. Now, on this front, you need to leave one thing out to negotiate. Again, humanitarian hat, analytical hat. Humanitarian hat, Israel has always used civilian targets to kill people in order to get escalation and additional negotiation power for its proxy US military industrial complex, and all the factions of transnational military industrial complex, including Britain, Germany, France, Israel, and America. And so all eyes turn to the agreement being agreed, but what was the one thing that broke the ceasefire, or the ceasefire that never really held? It was around Lebanon. And so this, I believe, is the final act, assuming that the pragmatic version of Iran that is going to lead the next order with the reformist or the IRGC that is on board with this China plan is already live now. Then that will make this the final act. And we'll keep covering it until we know what actually happened as well. But Hezbollah, again, humanitarian hat versus reality versus analytical. In this world order, Hezbollah is no longer an asset. It was an asset to Iran when it needed leverage to renegotiate the removal of sanctions. It was a resistance against an Israeli invasion. But if Israel's being reformed, then Lebanon needs to integrate Hezbollah into the state army. No easy task. There are people that won't be on board with that. And then there is agreement that will lead to an integration of Hezbollah into the political process and the military process. But the point here is that if Iran is no longer backing resistance, because the mission is now state stability, regional stability through economic agreements, then we need something that maintains the credibility of Iran in terms of backing its resistance, Israel in terms of protecting its borders, and America in terms of looking strong while it's retreating to a regional power, as well as Lebanese interest, which integrates into France interest. And we got a pivot from France leading up to this. It's no coincidence that when Bahrain put forward the ceasefire agreement, there were 3 objections from the UN Security Council: China, Russia, and France. France then came into Lebanon. France was one of the people that received Iranian shipments to deal with their energy crisis. And France effectively started changing its allegiances based upon its Lebanese interests. And then we get this escalation. So you can see the lead up to where we're actually getting. But in this new world order, effectively in regional stability, the proxies are no longer assets, because the military doesn't have, Israel exists because of its justification of always being attacked. So it would create the environment that would lead to the attack. And then Iran would create the resistance, and that created the strategic tension that created the forever war. The forever war propped up the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, assured that energy couldn't unify and go eastwards. And therefore, you needed a continual state of war to prop up the system and the petrodollar and enforce it. But under this new model, Hezbollah's a liability. So what does Iran's pragmatists aim to achieve right now? The end of the forever war strategic tension, secure sanction relief, renegotiate any of the economic opening up of markets in order to set the framework, which in the future will probably be energy pipelines from Iran via the GCC, funded or built by China with financial industrial complex infrastructure in order to economically tie everyone together. And in the original negotiation that was announced by Arachi of IRGC and confirmed by the Iranian government, Preshmirov, sorry, I always forget that name and get it wrong. Anyway, I believe that Lebanon was left as a deliberate negotiation chip. It sets, I don't think it's a red line, but it is the framework by which to manage this transition. And it led to the escalation cycle of effectively a situation that gets so unbearable that everyone has the narrative to go towards the three-way victory. So what is actually happening is Iran is effectively has manufactured controlled outrage because it's unacceptable to leave Hezbollah. And so it's, they're trying to prevent escalation publicly. Hezbollah is basically being degraded because Israel launched a brutal attack, civilian targets as well as Hezbollah. Now, Israel can only do it from the plains, from above. Whenever they do a ground invasion, Hezbollah weakens Israel. And so Hezbollah allegedly has taken out over 100 tanks. There's been a lot of unreported IDF deaths. And every time Israel has done a ground invasion, Hezbollah has kicked ass. And so we're getting, these weakening of Israel IDF assets through ground invasion and weakening of Hezbollah through air forces and the Israeli air forces, which is creating the environment for economic weakness in Israel and a framework for the integration of Hezbollah into the Lebanese army eventually, which will be enforced through some kind of tiered agreement moving forward. So Lebanon is now asserting sovereignty, and we're getting this massive escalation from Israel, where it's effectively getting rid of any strategic locations that are needed for any of the future ports and portway and pathways are going to be built as well in the Build Back Better phase. So basically, Israel is removing the proxy burden of Iran, and it's almost like an outsourcing agreement with a forward-facing story in order to manage this transition without having a revolution and an uprising that would create regional instability that would then lead to the forever war as well. So the transition form is effectively a proxy war to basically proxy assets to state assets. And that is the deal that I think we're witnessing right now. Okay, so that is what I think the final act is. Now, this could go on for quite some time. We don't know how long that takes. But I also believe, think about it. What does the US want? The US is in an economic crisis right now if the Strait opens, because all the reasons that we've covered in the market updates. Every time the price of oil gets to $115, it increases the likelihood of a depression in the fallout supply chain. Every time the US debt yield on the 10-year treasury gets to 4.5, that creates something that could break in the mortgage market that breaks the banking and the private credit market. The weaker the GCC gets, the less AI investment they're going to get from the sovereign wealth funds. The closer the 30-year bond gets to the 5%, the less likely US is able to roll over its debt. If it can't roll over its debt, then the Fed is the last buyer, and the Fed leads to the big print, which strategically weakens the dollar again and ends the dollar as world reserve currency as it gets more distressed. And then you have the breaking of the petrodollar, the Japan carry trade, the euro dollar, and everything we've talked about. So you can't allow it to go above those points, but you want to keep it at those points to have the managed transition, and you want to get the price of oil lower once the deal is actually settled, but higher than where it previously was, to create the K-shaped economy, asset stripping exercise, global reset, where massive concentration of wealth, as happens in every crisis like the 2008 financial crisis or long-term capital management or the Russia-Ukraine war or COVID, is always concentrating wealth upwards into those that own the asset and fewer hands. But anyway, so who actually benefits? Because some people are pushing out the US benefits and therefore Trump is playing 5D chess. But that, if you think Trump works for the American people, doesn't add up. If Trump is a puppet for the financial industrial complex, technical industrial complex, and military industrial complex, it makes perfect sense, which is burden the Americans with debt, do Operation Warp Speed 2.0, further this along like he did with COVID, and do the same for this massive wealth transfer as a result of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the global reset. So we have to ask ourselves the question to understand this. Inadvertently or coordinated, you pick. I believe there's coordination. I also believe there's inadvertent benefit that adjusts based upon capital flows and is managed by asset managers like Transnational Capital, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Who benefits? The US private sector, but a tiny subset of it. 1% of the US economy is energy sales by private companies. They're the primary winner. The consumer loses. 60% of the US economy is consumption. 50% of all consumption is by the wealthiest 10%. If you push up prices, the lower 50%, you get demand destruction. Recession caused the big print and the global reset. And the wealthy people, they're inelastic. They'll pay whatever. But the mid-class, that need to borrow against their stock, if you get destruction in the stock market, you also get the wiping out of the middle class. And through any of these military operations, you remove some of the aging population. So you can see how this works in their spreadsheets and formulas. So the primary winner is a few companies in the US. They profit because effectively, in a debt-based Ponzi scheme with a big print, you privatize the losses and socialize all of the gains and the benefit for the key businesses. So who's going to benefit from it? Cheniere Energy is getting all of the LNG export contracts as a result of it. ExxonMobil, they're getting a bunch of the different types of contracts, and they are shareholders in the Golden Pass energy LNG infrastructure. 70% owned by Qatar, 30% owned by Exxon. They were timed perfectly to benefit from this as well. Chevron obviously is going to be getting much higher oil prices globally as a result of the old US empire. So this is more power. BlackRock's assets under administration have gone up from $12 trillion to $14 trillion. Transnational capital, all of the sovereign wealth funds, all of the investment banks, they're managing $25 trillion of wealth through BlackRock's Aladdin technology. So they're doing scenario planning through their AI. They go into BlackRock's Aladdin, say, how do I scenario plan for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz? It will tell you where to allocate the capital. And most of it, a lot of it, has been done algorithmically through integration into BlackRock's ETF structures. So now we're getting these structural reallocations of capital based upon BlackRock's Aladdin technology, based upon the sovereign wealth funds and transnational capital plugging into BlackRock's funds, who also benefit from these managed portfolios and scenario planning. So they get the higher oil price leverage in negotiating all these points because everyone's going through an energy crisis. Halliburton stroke SLB, they're going to be doing reconstruction phase, most likely, from the US side. But there is also nationalized interest. So remember, America is controlled by private interests, financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, technical industrial complex. Of course, there is massive AI bailout that will receive the big print. Now, China's building the AI, so you get all the podcasts saying China's going to win the AI race, China's going to win the AI race. That creates the narrative and justification for the big print. The global reset enforces the $7 to $10 trillion guaranteed big print. That's wealth conversation, socializes losses, privatized gains. If the Gulf countries can't invest, then you create an AI crisis through higher energy prices, at the same time as AI and robotics becoming a strategic national security narrative. Trump then increases the budget for the military from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. Military companies do great. Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Boeing. Palantir gets their AI technology. Elon gets to build his AI robotics social credit score. When housing becomes unaffordable, you got Tesla houses, which is a surveillance state house. When cars and energy becomes unaffordable, you get automated cars via Tesla. And other players as well, obviously. Then you get everyone talking on social media. X becomes your social credit score, which becomes a financial app, which integrates with Genius Act, which integrates into Suspicious Activity Report and the Patriot Act and everything, and the Genius Act. You got a big, beautiful bill that allocated all the budgets over to those few companies, and the American people are broke. They pay the bill, and you socialize the losses and privatize the gains. Now you have the narrative for energy lockdowns globally, energy crisis, COVID all over again, combined with the 1973 oil embargo stagflation, combined with the big print bailout of 2008, combined with the breaking of the private credit market, like long-term capital management that leads to force majeure contracts, and you've got the almighty biggest print that we've likely ever seen, combined with the regime change at the Federal Reserve to somebody that might be hawkish. And if he's hawkish, he can destroy the US empire if they wanted to do that, or he can put those interest rates low in order to strip all the lost assets in the K-shaped economy, while ETF and BlackRock manages capital outflows. At the end of this war, we go back to the strategic weakening of the dollar, the outperformance of foreign currencies against the dollar, which strengthened during this war. But then if we get the end, we go back, and foreign stock markets outperforming the S&P in order to manage a transition and asset strip the West, concentrate power. Trump did a great job. Who else benefits? What about those that nationalize their energy? Who's that? Higher oil prices benefits those countries that did that. There's only really a couple of them, and they got sanction relief. So you got higher oil prices that increased your national energy, and those countries got sanction relief while in a proxy war with America. And that is Russia and Iran. They are both members of BRICS. Trump is a BRICS salesperson, and he's deconstructing everything that propped up the petrodollar in the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. That's why he was installed. And it started with tariffs, as I said, that drove everyone to China and renegotiated every agreement, reset everything. And then you get the environment where you get sanctions relief. So the structural upside of everything benefits Iran and Russia, while simultaneously weakening Israel infrastructure, Iran infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt by who? China. You get this? Leading up to the China summit, which was meant to be in April, but got extended till May, which is where Xi Jinping and Trump have their meeting. What did China do leading up to this? Built the largest reserves of everything in the world. And with their Belt and Road Initiative, started selling down their US treasuries from 1.4 trillion to now about 650 billion. They didn't want to break the dollar. They wanted the dollar to continue on its path, weaken it, manage the transition, while building the manufacturing base and investing in Africa and all the countries that have populations. Now, China has its own demographic issue, the one-child policy. That's going to get worse and worse. So they're using AI at the state level to build AI and robotics. They're not doing what America's doing, building AI and robotics to commercialize it, but the government will pay for it through the big print. So you're doing the China model, but you're privatizing the gains. China keeps the gains in order to build the manufacturing base within China so that it can deal with this demographic issue. But where's the demand going to come from when you have structural unemployment in both? It's going to come from the countries that still have populations. Africa, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, many of the African nations, some of the Middle Eastern nations, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. So you're creating structural demand in the Middle East. Why do you think BlackRock is managing multipolarity? Because they don't have the population. And so instead, they're manufacturing the police and surveillance state in the West, which was built upon the China model. If you're an asset manager, that's what you do. And you do that with a multi-decade strategy by controlling access to capital. And you need wars in order to manage that global reset, usher in the police and surveillance state, build up the countries with population growth, and build a surveillance state in the regions with population shrinkage and an aging population. The aging population has to choose between eating and heating in order to deal with the pension crisis, because those liabilities are going up and up and up. And the bondholders are controlling the 30-year yield. The banks are controlling the 10-year yield. And big oil and the deep state and the military industrial complex are controlling the oil prices and all the different world commodity prices, while the technical industrial complex is building the police and surveillance state. You get what's happening here? The Western governments have been captured. This is the model in play. And this is how they manage a transition. China built the largest reserves in the world so that they're prepared. They originally said China's going to run out within 3 weeks. Then they said 3 months. Then they said 6 months. Then they said a year. China's fully prepared. And what happened with Singapore, who may be negotiating their port in the New World Order? China sent 2 million barrels of oil over to Singapore. Russia's bailing out Indonesia and Malaysia in their energy crisis. And China's going to be rebuilding what used to be called the Middle East and will now likely be West Asia forever. What is Israel doing? Pariah state in the West, aligning with India. While UAE gets vassalized into the financial industrial complex, so does Israel, so does India, so that India can become the strategic tension in a competing manufacturing base with China. And UAE becomes the FIC outpost, while Saudi Arabia becomes the global leader within the GCC. The ports are renegotiated so that US can exit. The defense contracts are renegotiated so that the US can exit. and they're likely to be renegotiated eastwards with compensation to the private financial industrial complex that controls the West, that is funding the police and surveillance state and doing the closed border, open border policy for Palantir, for Tesla, for David Sachs, the PayPal mafia that implemented the Genius Act and the AI infrastructure and the modern Operation Warp Speed 2.0. Anyway, this is absorbing the global transition while transitioning to a multipolar world order. So I'm going to just summarize the final parts of it. But just before we do that, let's go to one more AI video that kind of shows you how the Zionism as an ideology is becoming a toxic asset as you build the acquisition strategy for Israel and the asset stripping of America and the West. And Trump goes deeper and deeper and deeper into Zionism, which is removing his popularity, ready for the regime change, ready for Netanyahu being blamed for October the 7th, ready for a GCC puppet government in Israel, and that will usher in for the financial industrial complex. So what does Netanyahu need? He needs a war so that he can buy more time because he's negotiating his exit and his next court process starts this weekend. And he's got the genocide case in the international court. So Trump is doing everything he can to help Netanyahu while sanctioning the international courts, which weakens America because this was part of the United Nations structure that propped up the post-World War II Bretton Woods. And what does Netanyahu need? He needs another war because the Strait has to open yesterday in order to manage these oil prices. The negotiations are probably done. And so they can't have a war with Iran because the Strait can't open. So they need a war with Lebanon in order to buy the time and serve the strategic goals, which is why likely my prediction is that Lebanon will be taken out of the agreement. And they need to create the type of environment that makes that acceptable with the three-way victory narrative to do the exit, open the Strait, and the negotiation that is obviously happening around the Strait with everyone pulling their levers as well. So with that in mind, I'd love to put a bit of trolling that was done by Iran on the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. Let's go over to that AI video, then we'll close up and go to part 2, the big print.
Don't let go. Whatever you do, don't let go!
I'll never let go, Donnie.
I'm flying, Don! I'm flying!
Please! Please, I need another trillion or so! Anything for you, BB.
Okay, let's wrap all this up together anyway in terms of what comes next, and then let's do a little summary and point you to where you can get more information if you haven't had enough already. And then we'll be moving over to part 2, where I will be doing my session with the author of the big print, Lawrence Lepard. So what do I expect to happen next? Well, I think we're going to see some continued staged escalation. And by stage, humanitarian hat, tragedy, crimes against humanity. Analytical hat, negotiated outcome, moving towards the final stage. Staged escalation. There's going to be a lot of negotiation optics. There's going to be people saying, we're not negotiating. There's going to be people, saying, yeah, the deal's off, the deal's on. The negotiations, I believe, have been continual throughout this whole process, even before the war begun. And this war was part of that negotiation of executing what was agreed. So lots more negotiation optics. We may get more delays. We may get more weeks that we have to do this. But directionally, I think unless something changes, I don't need to analyze every single moment, and I may get some of the moments wrong. But directionally, I think we're headed based upon following the money and who benefits and how the world actually works in terms of power dynamics. So the final agreement that will eventually be announced that will transition the West Asia into regional stability will look something like this. Eventually, there will be full Iran integration and full normalization. Eventually, I don't know how long that's going to take. It will be tiered, maybe. There's a gradual transition, but nothing stops this train. This will be a US partial withdrawal where effectively you're switching the military industrial complex privatized interest with the financial industrial complex privatized interest. They may get defense contracts, AI contracts, those types of things, but it's not going to be rebuilt the same. It's not going to be the Gulf countries, publicly very angry. And this has obviously been a big hit to the economy for those that weren't in the inner circle of the highest level of negotiations. There will be massive regional reconstruction contracts by local organizations, probably within Saudi and various other companies in UAE and stuff like that. That will make up for some of the economic losses. And it will be built by Asian populations in Southeast Asia, as well as maybe some Chinese reconstruction contracts as well. It will end the US forever war model in the region, not the forever war model. There is always forever wars, but in the region, they've negotiated the exit through the financial industrial complex, I believe. They'll be handing over US assets over to the FIC players that are involved in these negotiations. And they'll be building the technical industrial complex, police and surveillance state in the West, but also providing infrastructure for AI data centers that's probably powered by nuclear energy that will obviously have their own security, internal sovereign infrastructure as well, which we need to keep an eye on all around the world. That's a global trend, both on the China side and the US side. It will be the end of the US-dominated United Nations. Maybe UN falls. Maybe it moves out of America. Maybe it gets on without America contributing. Maybe they're not a part of the Security Council. Whatever happens to the UN, expect a managed transition away from the Bretton Woods version. The end of the US-dominated NATO, which was a sales strategy for the US military-industrial complex. Rather than America contributing to prop up the empire, it would just use it as a sales strategy, so hand over all the profits from wars up to the military-industrial complex in Germany, in the UK, in France, in mainly America, and some of the Israeli contracts will be integrated into the GCC infrastructure as well. And US dominant trade ports. So we may get this model based upon the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe it stands up in international law, maybe it doesn't. But if we do get this model, then I think we're going to see more and more of those around all of the strategic choke points and trade ports around the world in a multipolar empire that will prop up multipolar currencies. So based upon geography and proximity to geography, they will be transacted in currencies. So that means we don't get this structural bid always over to the dollar. We've already seen the end of US-dominated USAID and National Endowment of Democracy. These were the deep state operations that propped up the dollar, the regime changes, the currency wars that enforced dollar dominance. By exposing that corruption early on, that effectively had a repackaging, which was a signal to the world that things are changing. Weaken the petrodollar, which obviously this has achieved. Now, the Iran war strengthened it if America was going to go in, occupy, put 4 million troops in, take the oil, and then price it in dollar. But the MAGA narrative, the Q-tards, think that's happening. in order to strengthen the petrodollar as well as the stablecoin narrative. But what's really happening is the petrodollar strengthened throughout the Iran war. But as soon as the war ends, you'll get dollar price down back to the weakening of the dollar. Yields will become more sustainable. And you buy more time to extract more wealth from the West as well. You weaken the Japan carry trade by Japan increasing their rates in an oil crisis and a inflation crisis. So then they can increase those rates, which breaks the Japan carry trade. And 40% of all bond auctions are being done by hedge funds using effectively borrowed money and derivatives contracts 100-to-1 leverage. That breaks that source of funding, which pushes to the big print, where the Fed socialized the losses, privatized the gains for bondholders. You weaken the euro dollar by allowing some of the relationship into LNG contracts, but you vassalize Europe further and further and further into a weakened state, so that you can just extract as much as you can, but you weaken the euro dollar effectively. You do continual sanction on those that use USDT stablecoins via the Genius Act. You do continual, we've already had the weakening of US treasuries over to gold as the #1 reserve asset for central banks. You continue destabilizing the stability of trades with US so that everybody continues, and I think there's a lot more to go with gold. You do continual pricing in a multipolar world into Bitcoin transactions, which creates structural demand. You create the environment of a police state, so everyone wants to self-custody, so that those that want to exit the system can do that. Use tariffs in order to push business over to China and away from America. You use basically, that pushes everyone to you push narrative that effectively makes America look like an unstable trading partner and China look like a stable trading partner. And then all of this, by my estimation, needs to be wrapped up with Lebanon as the final front, way before May the 14th for the China summit, where Xi Jinping and Trump have that meeting, which will mark the end of the Bretton Woods order, particularly if a deal is done via the Strait of Hormuz. Then you'll have a global decolonization process from the US empire, and it will become the regional hegemon with Europe, Canada, and the Northern Hemisphere effectively via the West. So this is not about who wins the war. Everyone will declare that they won the war. Israel will say they won the war. America will say they won the war. Iran will say they won the war. IRGC will still be maintained, but pragmatic, aligned with China BRICS and the regional stability plan. It's all about, effectively, who captures energy markets. Iran will have some, the Gulf countries will have some, and the private interest across the West, as well as Guyana, Brazil. There's what happens with Australia, various other things. Russia. Whoever maintains the energy routes ends up with a significant chunk of the control in this new world order. Who controls reconstruction contracts? Whoever invests ends up with the strategic equity and partnership in those that reconstruct the energy contracts. Who shapes the next global order is determined by these new energy, these new ports, and these new infrastructure redevelopment. What is the West going to do when it is increasingly asset stripped? As I've been preparing people all along, there's only one option: big print. Print more money, get the Federal Reserve to buy the treasuries as less and less foreign investors buy them. And then maybe you reconstruct an environment of lower interest rates and enforce them on pensioners, enforce these subsidized rates through some kind of martial law or whatever you need to do. But those bonds will be purchased by Americans and by the Federal Reserve. And the beneficial owners the bondholders that hold the old treasuries will asset strip, and the ones that get the low artificial subsidized ones will effectively be the bag holders as we manage this transition. And if that breaks, then we end up in a scenario that people often talk about called the Great Taking. You can look it up. Maybe I'll end up doing a panel discussion or something with the guy that wrote the Great Taking book as well. But effectively, there has been legal changes where the only assets you own are the ones in self-custody. Because even if you own shares, the DTCC, the clearinghouse, holds a beneficiary record of the broker that owns it. And if the broker owns it and you don't own it and the DTCC owns it, then who owns the actual commodity, the actual underlying assets? The custodians. Who are the custodians? The ETFs. So if you did the Great Taking, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if the big print stops working, you effectively do bail-ins. You do socializing losses and privatizing gains in the big print, but eventually, who has the assets wins. Self-custody. That is the Bitcoin story. That is the gold story. And you need to be clear of your custodial relationships in all your financial transactions. That's what I'm trying to prepare everybody for. Have a 10-year plan. Start today. Become more sovereign. Own assets in self-custody. Boycott the Federal Reserve System by owning Bitcoin in self-custody. Boycott BlackRock X, own gold in self-custody, Bitcoin in self-custody. Boycott the banks by not using your assets as collateral so they own them during big prints and great takings. Spend local, really important. Your local infrastructure will determine your quality of life. You as an individual, your family, and your local people, your local farmers, your local supply chains. Push all your money to them, not to global multinational institutions. Start questioning your supply chains. How do we work together to solve our supply chains? Now is the time to start thinking about, why is fertilizer coming from the Middle East anyway? Because it's poison petrochemicals from big oil. So why do we need to import fertilizers from a country that's dominated by sand? Is that natural? Am I poisoning myself? Is this why there's a cancer pandemic? Am I contributing to helping them solve their pension crisis by being unhealthy, by being psychologically unstable? Am I contributing to the AI and robotics trade by not having children? Am I beating inflation by holding the assets that beat this? Am I spending less than I earn and investing the difference? What am I investing in? Who owns it? What's the custody relationship? Am I dependent upon one country? Do I have my assets in another jurisdiction through title? Do I have a passport in another country? Or have I got everything exposed to one job, one income stream, one country that may end up confiscating my assets? I know it's overwhelming, but this is why you start now. You don't get perfect. You just chip away each and every month and make sure that you're working on your contingency strategies. So anyway, I know this is a lot of information. What I do is I break this down into blogs on SimonDixon.com, where if you haven't got time to watch them all, I do AI videos into 5-minute summaries and 15-minute summaries. If you didn't watch weeks 1 to 6, let me just do a little bit of a recap. I started doing analysis like this every single week. Iran week 1 was the opening shock. Iran war week 2 was the escalation phase. Iran war week 3 was the settlement phase before anyone was calling it a settlement. Iran war week 4 was the Build Back Better phrase, the destruction that needs to happen for the Build Back Better. The Iran war week 5 was by saying the market now determines the outcome and the duration, and that you can see the reset and the global reset based upon the market that's setting the parameter in the bond market and the oil market. Iran war week 6, which is what we covered this week, is the final acts. We discussed Lebanon being the bargaining chip and the end game that actually comes from here. And always remember, analytical hat off, humanitarian hat off. This system needs to die. It is crimes against humanity. You need to exit. If you contribute to the system with your money, boycott it. The crimes against humanity that are happening in Lebanon and Gaza right now, the people that are dying in America through this asset stripping exercise, the West by our governments not favoring people, Iranians that are just on the wrong side of sanctions. I mean, effectively, even the real terrorists, the IDF, that are doing this, they're subject to a bunch of brainwashing. Remember that interview I did with the Bitcoiner that's an ex-IDF soldier? You know, we had that conversation with religion as being weaponized. We are all humans. This is humanity. This is a humanitarian crisis. And all they care about is us voting with our money. That's what we do. We boycott, we go local, and we get more human by having more human relationships. Starts with ourselves, then goes to our loved ones, then goes to our local community. Prioritize in that order, and you'll get through whatever they throw, because at the other side, they're going to need people. Always remember, you're alive at one of the craziest, interesting, and most exciting times for some people, but for less and less people. Some are going to get hurt, others are going to get wrecked. I want you to be on the right side of this change. I want you to have the protection and sovereignty to be able to do it peace, love, and unity, because the others ain't going to be able to do that. We're going through this transition together, and I'll keep covering every week my analysis. Follow the money so that you can get ahead, years ahead of those that are following the media and the politicians. Opt out of politics. You don't vote your way out of it. It makes no difference whatsoever. The Chinese are kicking ass right now because they're not wasting time in a political system that they think they can change. You can't change this. The only way you can change this is by becoming the lobby. You become the lobby by becoming rich. You become rich by beating the system, follow the money, understand the game, and then you can do with your money how to really change the world. That's how you change things. And you need 10 years to do it. So if you've not been doing it for years, I've got more and more people that are sovereign right now, Iranians that weren't being killed because they were sovereign and they were able to take their Bitcoin with them as currencies were being destroyed. All around the world, I got messages from people, because I've been sharing this ever since Bitcoin was $3, for people to own more Bitcoin this month than last month, learn self-custody, run a node, hedge with Bitcoin, with gold in self-custody. You know, then get your structuring right. Do everything legally, do it by the book. It's a spiritual mission. We will be judged for how we act. We ain't going to solve the world, but shit's going to be thrown at us, and we either do more good or do more bad. That's the only choice. Perfection is the enemy. You're not going to get this perfect. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to learn. There's only two choices, better or worse. And when they test me, when I have those easy decisions to go down an evil path, am I going to be taken down a compromise network? Because we're being tested. When your money goes into good, I found that it gets 10x the return. 10x the return. There is a spiritual energy with your money. When it goes bad, it takes you back. And it comes back to bite. So with that in mind, let's transition to part 2. Part 2 is the big print beginning. What that looks like. With the author of the big print, I was invited onto BTC sessions with myself and Lawrence Lepard. And we went through everything from war, markets, the big print, the military industrial complex, the reset, and an alternative perspective on what this looks like. So enjoy part 2, enjoy the interview, and I'll see you next week. Peace.